How's it going? My name is Andy Monroe and welcome back to my YouTube channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about the 5 things I wish I knew before I threw my first event. I have learned so much in my events career so far, and there are so many things I wish I had known before I started throwing events. However, for the sake of today's video and both of our times, I'm going to keep today's video to the 5 things I wish I had known before I threw my first live event. All right, let's dive into it. The first thing that I wish I had known before throwing my first live event is that I don't need to do everything at the event. And this is something that I've talked about in my previous videos, but it's extremely important to delegate projects when you are planning a live event, and especially when you are actually executing on that event that you've been planning. At the first event I ever planned and threw, I was doing it with one of my business partners, and we both thought that we had to be responsible for everything. So for the entire duration of the event, we were running around trying to solve every single problem, trying to micromanage every single person, and trying to make sure every single part of the event was running smoothly. And that honestly decreased the quality of the event, decreased the experience for our attendees, and also decreased the experience for the staff that we had working the event because we just weren't properly managing them. As an event planner, it is not your responsibility to do every single job at the event. It is your responsibility to ensure that the event is successful, and it's also your responsibility to put the right people in the right place to ensure that the event is successful. So instead of trying to do every single job at the event, you should put members of your team in leadership roles and give them responsibility over different segments of the event. For example, somebody should be over registration, somebody should be over sales, somebody should be over merchandise, somebody should be over speaker management, somebody should be over security, somebody should be over front stage, and somebody should be over backstage. Someone should be over AV. And yes, you still have responsibility over these different segments of the event, but that doesn't mean that you have to do them yourself. You should pick members of your team that you trust and put them in charge of the different segments of the event. And then everybody that works under them can report up to them, and then those team managers that you put in place can report up to you. So instead of having to be in charge of 25 to 50 people, you're only in charge of like 5 to 10, which makes your life a lot easier. However, if you do follow this approach of putting different members of your team in charge of different segments of the event, it is your responsibility to properly train them so that they can succeed in their role. And also you want to equip them with all of the information and all of the right answers so that if their team asks them questions, they will know how to respond instead of coming and grabbing you every single time there's a question. So if you're going to delegate your projects, make sure you are still taking complete ownership over those projects even though they're delegated, and make sure you are properly training your team leaders so that they are equipped to succeed in their role. The second thing I wish I knew before throwing my first live event is that a lot of the value that attendees get at an event is in the connections and the relationships they build in the hallways and at your networking events. Yes, it's good to deliver a lot of quality from the speakers and the material that you are presenting on stage at the event. However, at least in my experience and the feedback that I've gotten in the surveys at the events I've planned, is that people really enjoy meeting others and building relationships and finding potential partners to work with. And I've also learned that if you don't give your attendees enough time to network, they're going to do it themselves, which means they're not going to be participating and engaged in your event. So ever since I learned this, I have made it a goal of mine to incorporate as many networking opportunities as possible into my events to make sure I'm delivering on top of the value that's being delivered on stage. So make sure you're giving your attendees plenty of time to network and connect with each other. The third thing I wish I knew before throwing my first live event is that everything, and I literally mean everything, is so expensive. When I first started throwing events, I just had no idea how expensive stuff was in the events industry. So when I started making budgets for events, they were low beyond reality. They were not realistic in terms of the event that we were trying to throw. In fact, the first event I ever threw, I had a $250,000 budget in place. By the time the event was over, I had spent $750,000. That's just because I set such an unrealistic budget, and it's because I didn't know how expensive things were in the events industry. So if you've never thrown an event in your life and you're looking to getting into this industry, get ready to see some outrageous quotes. And that doesn't mean that you have to partake in those quotes. You can still find ways to save money on your event. However, things are just going to be expensive, and at some point you aren't going to be able to get around it. The fourth thing that I want to talk about is that most venues don't have enough food to support and accommodate your attendees. And that's why they have a significantly overpriced food and beverage package to offer you when you are signing up to throw an event at their venue. I learned this the hard way at the first event I ever threw because we were only providing one lunch at that event, and that lunch was only for VIP members. So the other 700 attendees had to go and try and get food from 2 restaurants that existed on the venue. And that simply just wasn't enough. And we definitely got a lot of feedback from our attendees that they wish that there was more food options at the event. Now, at least in my experience when I'm attending events, food is usually a nightmare anyways. It's a bit unrealistic to expect the event planners to provide meals, to provide breakfast, lunch, and dinner for a couple thousand people, that would just be super expensive. So whenever I go to an event, I just know it's going to be hard to find food. However, I didn't know how few accommodations existed at these venues that I was throwing events at. So if you aren't going to provide food to your attendees, you should get ready to hear some feedback about how bad the food options are. And one creative way I actually saw an event do to get around this is that they called in food trucks to surround the venue whenever it was time for lunch and whenever it was time for dinner. And I don't know if they had to pay for these food trucks. They might have had to pay for some rental fee or some fee from the venue itself to have these food trucks parked on their site. However, we were still buying food from these food trucks. So it was a really good situation for them, and I can't imagine that those food trucks charged the event planners to be there because they were making so much money. So there definitely are creative ways to get around this, but just know food is going to be a tricky situation when you're throwing events. And the fifth and final thing, at least for this video, that I wish I knew before throwing my first live event is that you need to communicate with your attendees like they are 5 years old. And this is not an insult to them, not insulting their intelligence or their maturity, but you really do need to over communicate with your attendees or they're going to get confused, they're going to get lost, and they're going to get angry. When I first started my event planning career, I kind of just thought people would understand how events worked. You know, where to go find registration and where to find the ballroom and where to find the merch store and who's allowed to go to the VIP dinner and who's allowed to go to the VIP lunch. But that just simply wasn't the case. You can't blame the attendee either. They're coming to this place that they've never been before, surrounded by a bunch of people they don't know, and it is kind of confusing to find your way around. And I made the mistake of assuming that people would just understand instead of over communicating with them. So now for my events, I make sure to over communicate in the simplest way possible to my attendees so that the event is easy to navigate for them. And trust me, if you properly communicate to your attendees, this will significantly increase the quality of experience they have at your event. It'll create a flow state at your event instead of friction. And that is the name of the game for throwing successful events. All right, that was the 5 things I wish I knew before throwing my first live event. And there are probably 100 others that I could talk about, so I'll probably make more videos on this topic. But please drop a comment down below if you have any questions, and also feel free to reach out to me as well. I love events, and I would love to answer your questions and help you in any way I can. All right, that's all I got for today's video. I'll see you in the next one.